morning we come once again seeking your still speaking voice, wanting to hear your fresh word for us this morning, speaking into our lives, shaping us. And so we ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts would be pleasing to you. And where we depart from your Spirit, O God, may that quickly fall away. Amen. So Solomon finished his father's dream. He built a temple, a place for God to dwell among God's people. It's an odd concept, really, to try to contain a God who cannot be contained in anything, even the whole universe, even the heavens. But I challenge you, go and trace any of the capital campaigns or the use of slave labor of any religious institution over the last several thousand years, and you will notice that we humans have been on this endeavor for quite some time. He builds a temple, a place for God to live. Before that, God had been homeless. The kind of God you'd find up at Pinellas Hope, living in a tent. It made sense, right, when God's people themselves were homeless, wandering around in the desert, refugees coming out of Egypt. It's a kind of divine solidarity. But when the people settled down, when they erected places for themselves to live, when they fluffed up pillows for their own heads, when they polished tables for their own eating, when the kings began to live ornately and extravagantly, God's homelessness among them became a scandal. How could they live so lavishly when God lived in a tent, an impermanent makeshift home carried place to place? So Solomon builds a temple, and he blesses it, and he prays over it. And his prayer includes all the things you would expect to find there that Bev so nicely summed up for us. Protection and provision for his people. Correction and forgiveness when they hurt each other or when they turn their backs on God. And then right there in the middle of it, right there in the middle of this blessing and these prayers over this new house of God, one petition sticks out like a sore thumb. He prays for foreigners, for strangers, for those people who perhaps his people, Solomon's people, fear, whether rationally or irrationally. For we all have a tendency to fear what we don't know. He prays for those people who don't belong to his people, but who very much still belong to God, and who will come to this temple seeking God. And he asks God to do something quite remarkable. For God to do all that this foreigner asks of God, so that all the peoples of the earth will know God and will know that God dwells there among Solomon's people. Now I want you to imagine this for a moment. Imagine the President of the United States. It doesn't matter which president you imagine. President is in an address to the nation, standing in the National Cathedral. And the president doesn't say, "Put us first." The president says, "Put immigrants first. Put the refugees and the asylum seekers first. Put the travelers we racially profile as potential terrorists and all those who come seeking a better life and the promises of God here in this place. Put them first. Answer their requests and their needs, so that all the people of the earth will know you and will know you dwell with us." Imagine the president saying, "God, yes, please bless America. but also please, and perhaps first, bless people of other nations, for they too belong to you and are your people. You see, Solomon was really quite wise. He understood that this building he had erected was God's house, not his. He understood that when his wayfarer God was no longer a wayfarer, in other words, when Solomon had basically tried to make God stay put in one place, he knew then that the wayfarers of the world would come looking for God in that place where he had housed God. The people of every nationality, color, language, and creed would come seeking God if God was there in that place. The temple was a place to worship, and he understood that worship wasn't just about him, and it wasn't just even about his people Israel, God's chosen. He wasn't the one being worshiped there in that temple, and neither, for that matter, were his people. It was the holy, living God being worshiped. That was bigger than him. Sometimes it's a song, and some days to God today. It felt like I was praying one thing and everyone else was praying something else. Or maybe like I was praying to the God I know and love, but the God everyone else seemed to be praying to, I didn't seem to recognize much. And so I felt isolated, felt disconnected. I felt uncomfortable in worship today. Or maybe it was, all of me and who God created me to be didn't feel welcome or included here in worship today. And so I didn't feel a part of it. Or perhaps, I felt so challenged and so pushed out of my comfort zone. I was having such trouble getting past my own fears or my anger, my guilt, my shame, my judgment of others, my own sense of self-righteousness. I had a hard time worshiping today. That's what happened, right, to that Pharisee that Jesus witnessed that one day who was praying next to the tax collector, saying, "Thank God I'm not like that one," right? That was his problem in worship that day, right? What about the opposite? What if you're feeling tempted to say, "I loved worship"? What might be a better way to express that? Felt like I okay, so you feel enlivened by the Spirit, right? Yeah. Welcomed, included, accepted, part of it. I felt part of it, right? Here's a few that I came up with. I felt really close to God and to those gathered here today. Or our prayers and our worship together today felt really honest or really full of hope. Or maybe even better yet, others around me today, they helped me to see God or myself in a whole new way. And so I was able to worship God more fully and pray more deeply today. Do you hear how in both of those cases, the positive and the negative, this sounds so different from the way we usually talk about worship and our spiritual life together. It's so different from the way we usually talk about God and what we do when we gather in this place. It's that subtle shift, right? From that consumer spectator mode to active participant. We're working with our daughter Joelle right now to make the shift from saying, "You made me feel angry," to saying, "I feel angry, Mom, when, for instance, you say I have to go to bed." They call that developing emotional intelligence. And you'll hear everyone from preschool teachers to therapists of 80-year-olds teaching the same thing. First, the challenge is to be able to name what you're actually feeling, and then to recognize that you have some agency in it. That while others might do all sorts of things that facilitate the feelings that emerge in you, you ultimately have agency in the creation and the sustaining of your own emotions. Well, maybe just as we call the way we talk about our feelings emotional intelligence, we should call the way we talk about our worship spiritual intelligence. And maturity in both of those things bears the same mark. To recognize our own agency in it, and that it is bigger than us. That not everything that happens in worship or in interactions with each other is always all about us. When we become mature, spiritually intelligent beings, we start to think not just about our own experience, but about others, like Gregory mentioned. think of the different kinds of questions that you can ask when you shift the way you talk about worship. Instead of just the standard, why didn't I feel fed in worship today or inspired? Really consumerist language, right? Instead of that, you might now ask, what was going on with me today that I wasn't feeling very connected in worship? Or you might even ask, I wonder if others feel as disconnected as I felt today on Sundays when I do feel connected. Gregory, you talked about that. We now can take responsibility for the congregation's worship as players on the team, so to speak. We also can ask, I wonder how God experienced our worship today. And you might find in asking such questions that it leads to a lot of self-discoveries or a lot of discoveries about God. When we decenter ourselves in worship and we center God, it's impossible for us not to trace the heartstrings of God. And some of them, of course, will lead right to you. And some of them will lead to the neighbors sitting next to you right now. But a lot of them will lead right out of this place. Maybe to people or places you'd rather they not go. Solomon certainly realized that. In building this temple and realizing it wasn't about him, but about something so much bigger, the living God, who was not his sole possession or even the sole possession of his people Israel, he then traced the heartstrings of God to every human being on the planet. And suddenly I imagine it all made sense. You know, the irony for Solomon is that he tried to wall in God. But in walling in God, who transcends all boundaries, he really ended up having to tear down the boundaries, even his national boundaries. Because that's what it means to have God with you. He also, I imagine, realized after building the temple that it wasn't just God's homelessness that was a scandal, but any homelessness. Now that he and God had these lavish houses, I imagine that inequity was all the more apparent. Long after Solomon, shortly before the destruction of Solomon's rebuilt temple, someone claiming to be Solomon's descendant would come on the scene to build a different kind of house for God. It would not be a stone-walled temple and not a tent, but a body with a face and skin. And again, in him, God would return to where God has always felt most comfortable. At home as a wayfarer, a traveler, a homeless God. And this one who came to make of his own body a house for God would make it clearer than it ever was before that God is housed in all wayfarers and all the homeless, all those without a place to lay their head, all strangers, all foreigners. In him, it would become deeply clear that not only was God's homelessness, in contrast to the comfort and security of some, a scandal, but all homelessness was a scandal. His life and ministry would make clear that we cannot build God's house without building a house for everyone. I wonder how you usually think about worship. Do you center yourself and your own experience, or do you center God and all the ones to whom God's heartstrings flow? I wonder if you've acknowledged your agency in worship. I wonder if you honor and respect the agency of others in worship, the way Solomon did. And if, like him, you're willing to tear down all those boundaries and dividing walls of hostility which God so easily transcends. You know, it's awfully hard in our world today to escape the identity that the world wants to just thrust on us. Often to the world, we are first and foremost a consumer, right? And that comes with a lot of pressures. Any of you been to a gas station recently? You can hardly go to any gas station these days without getting bombarded with this video advertisement, right? Everywhere we go, it's hard to find a landscape where there is not a sight or sound, or worse yet, smell or taste of someone trying to sell us something. You know, you can't access a single piece of information in the world today without seeing on the sidebar advertisements from your online stalkers who know just the last thing that you typed in that Google search bar or that Amazon search bar, right? What a relief, isn't it, in so many ways? That worship is not about our consumption, that we come into this space where we are moved out of the center, where God's love, and not our own desires or fears or needs, God's love guides us. What a relief to come into a space in a community where, yes, we sometimes feel some pressure when we're invited to participate in this way or that, or invest in this way or that, but where no one is encouraging us to hoard or stockpile or take more than we need, other than simply to soak in that never-ending, boundless love of God. What a relief to enter a sacred time and a community when we're encouraged to give without expectation, to receive freely, to co-create, to see things clearly, especially those scandals of inequity and the scandal of inclusion. Or at least that's what the church worship at its best, truest, purest form is meant to be. We don't always hit the mark. Solomon certainly recognized this. So my prayer for us this week, may God help us reframe our perspective on worship and on what we as a church do together. May we break out of that consumerist mentality about church. May it be so. Amen. Please stand and join in our next song.